There we go. All right, so you might have gotten a pop-up that says this is being recorded. So just know that you can click yes, I'm okay with being recorded. So I want to kick everything off by introducing the MRAC staff. This slide has small headshots of each staff member, which is a collection of 4 women and 1 man from a variety of racial backgrounds and all smiling faces in front of a pale yellow brick wall. The program directors are on that first row, which includes Masami Kawasato, Jovan Rebolar, and me, Scott Artley. The second row has the rest of the team, which is Executive Director Kathy Muchapau and Director of Administration Becky Franklin. We'll also soon have 2 more staff members. You may hear from even more people going forward. I'd like to give a quick overview of the state arts funding system and how MRAC fits into it. So thanks to the taxpayers of Minnesota, like you, who generate funding, the Minnesota legislature decides how funds for the arts are available through what's called the appropriation, which is the usual budgeting process, and then a special fund as part of the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. The logo for that amendment is on the left of this slide. The Legacy Amendment was an amendment to the state constitution passed by voters of Minnesota in 2008 that increased sales tax by 3/8% for 25 years. And about 20% of that legacy fund goes to the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. That money then goes to the Minnesota State Arts Board. Their logo is on the right, which is a state agency which distributes arts funding. From there, the Minnesota State Arts Board uses about 70% of those available state dollars for their own funding programs and services. You may be eligible for opportunities at the Minnesota State Arts Board, so be sure to check for opportunities there as well. And then that remaining 30% of available state arts dollars goes to the 11 regional arts councils. It's a system of 11 regional arts councils, each in charge of a region of Minnesota. MRAC is one of those regional arts councils. And in our previous year, MRAC distributed about $4.3 million. This is a map on the left of Minnesota split up into those 11 geographic regions, each for a regional arts council. Highlighted on the right is Regional 11, which is the Twin Cities Metro, with the counties of Carver, Hennepin, Anoka, Ramsey, Washington, Dakota, and Scott counties, with areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul also delineated within those. I'd like to also acknowledge that this region serves as the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. The MRAC region makes up about half the population of the state, and we receive about 40% of that funding from the Minnesota State Arts Board to distribute among the regional arts councils. The mission of the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council is to improve arts access for communities in the 7-county metropolitan regional area through support to artists and organizations. We're actually a separate nonprofit organization ourselves, meaning we're not a state agency like the Minnesota State Arts Board. So despite the fact that our funding comes from mostly state sources, we are a separate nonprofit. Because of this funding, however, coming from public sources, it's vital that all of these arts projects we fund serve communities at the center of what we do. Here are the grant programs for groups that are available from MRAC this fiscal year. So first is the Flexible Support Grant, which we're going to be talking about today. It's grants of up to $15,000 to support projects and programs led by groups and organizations creating access to the arts. Second is the Arts Impact for Groups grant. So this is up to $10,000 available to BIPOC, disability, and/or LGBTQIA2+ led groups for projects and programs creating access to the arts. So those are our 2 grant programs for groups this year. We also have 2 grant programs for individuals. The first is the Next Step Fund, which we've been offering for quite a while now. This is funded by the McKnight Foundation, so not public state dollars. This is private dollars from the McKnight Foundation. That's grants of up to $5,000 for the growth and stability of individual artists. And then our other new program for individuals this year is called Arts Impact for Individuals. So it's pretty similar to Arts Impact for Groups, but is up to $5,000 for projects led by BIPOC, disabled, and/or LGBTQIA2+ individuals to create access to the arts for communities and/or engage with communities through creative endeavors. We'll have lots more information about these other programs coming up soon, but as flexible support is our first run of the year, we wanted to get you all this information as soon as we could. So with that, this is where we're going to take our first pause for questions. On the right side of the slide, there's a large white question mark in a black circle, which means I'll take questions about the MRAC staff, state arts funding system, MRAC's mission or region, and MRAC's grant programs. If you have any questions, Masami, feel free to chat let me know what's in the chat.
Hi, Scott. So far, we do not have any questions in the chat.
All right, and we will have plenty of opportunities to answer questions throughout this. So if something from this first section occurs to you, feel free to ask those questions at anywhere in the process, and I'm happy to track back as needed.
And the second I said that, of course, there are now 2 questions in the chat, but I believe they relate to information that you will be presenting upcoming. Would you like for me to say these out loud right now?
I think that if you know that we've got it coming, let's just hold off on them for now. If those questions are not answered, please put them back in the chat toward the end of the presentation, just to make sure that we catch them. So I'm going to move us along then, if we don't have any new questions. All right, I'm going to move us along then. So like I said, we got a lot of stuff to chat through today, so I want to make sure we make space for everything. So first, I want to let you know if you have any need to contact someone during the application, we ask you to reach out based on the type of assistance that you need. So for questions about the general MRAC grant making process and technical assistance, like trouble logging into your account, please reach out to our general lines, which the email mrac@mrac.org or 651-645-0402. So you have questions about like, hey, when are we supposed to find out about whether we got the grant? That would be a great place to start your inquiry. Then for quick questions about eligibility and application process, I ask you to connect with the program director, who's the contact for each program or each round of the program. So I am the contact for round 1 of the flexible support program, which means I'm the first point of contact for the first round if there are quick questions. That said, we're all working together on programs. So as you go through the application process, you might be hearing from anyone on the staff. What is a brief or quick application question? If it's something that will probably be answered in an email under 2 sentences, that would be a great brief question. If it's something that's going to require something a little bit more, then we ask you to think about requesting assistance for extended assistance, which would involve a phone call or Zoom. So we get lots of questions. So we ask you to use this application assistance meeting request form on our website to help us make sure that we reach everyone in the order that they inquire with us. So you can go to the mrac.org/grants/flexible support. So the flexible support page on the MRAC website. Under the very last section, help with your application, there is a link to the application assistance meeting request form. So please fill that out. It'll ask for just some quick contact information, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Again, you might hear from anybody on staff. We do get lots and lots of questions throughout, but we're really seriously happy to help. My favorite part of this process is working with applicants, not doing all of the boring spreadsheet work. So we want to help you, but to help us help you, please do your best to read the guidelines thoroughly before reaching out with questions and really figure out what is the best way to reach out. Brief questions, extended assistance, technical assistance. Next, I will chat through the application process in general, so sort of zooming out to the overview of the application process. On this slide is a simple flow chart showing the application process as green arrows moving from one step to the next. First, we start out with the applicant and MRAC, so MRAC staff helping you with your applications. Then the deadline hits at the application deadline. Then staff check-in applications, which means we begin reviewing eligibility of applications. Then a group of peer panelists will review applications and individually score proposals. Panelists are trained on the grant guidelines and provided with a guide to help them rate each application on the grant criteria. We previously held panels in person because of the pandemic. We switched to doing online only reviews, which are not panels in the same sense that we had. Now we have people look at each application on their own, fill out a form through the grant interface, and everyone scores everything individually. So there is no meeting involved in the panel process anymore. We're continuing to do that process for this year at least, and in the future we may move back to an in-person or likely a hybrid model. But for now, we're still doing these individual processes. Then after panel reviews, grant funds will be allocated based on panel rankings and available funds. And we do aim to fund as many applications as possible. We're not holding back funds until we get better applications. We're really trying to give away as much money as possible. And then after that, the MRAC staff submits application rankings to the MRAC board of directors, who ultimately are the ones to make the final decision on funding. So that's the application process overall. On this slide, labeled application accessibility, there's the international disability symbol, a person using a wheelchair. We ask that all applicants apply online unless a disability prevents them from doing so. And we encourage you to contact us to begin a conversation about how to make sure you have an equal opportunity to apply. Guidelines are available online for screen reader software and translation programs, and we can also provide those in other formats if those work better for you. Solutions we have previously implemented for alternative applications include filling out an adapted form in Microsoft Word, providing verbal responses that MRAC staff will share via audio recording or transcribe, and really just encourage you to begin a conversation about how we can help. And you can contact the person, the program director designated for each round. On this slide, labeled before applying resources, on screenshot on the right is a screenshot of the grant resources page on the MRAC website, which a green arrow pointing to the resources tab. On this page, the resources page on our website, we do have things like templates to apply. So a Word version of all of the questions in the application that you could type in there directly before you upload it or before you input it onto the grant interface itself. There's also technical how-tos for the grant interface. There's links to sites to find demographic information about your region, and then a glossary of terms. There's lots of wonderful resources there. Be sure to check that out. A big resource before applying is program directors, so folks like me and Masami. Program directors are available to assist with your application. If you have a brief question, reach out to the contact listed. Remember, you might hear back from anybody. And then if you have that more extensive question, fill out the support form. We do take meetings for those extended support meetings. And in a meeting with us, we'll do some initial refining and framing of ideas with you, and we'll review the application materials for eligibility and completeness. But unfortunately, we're not able to help with reviewing content beyond eligibility. So I won't tell you, the phrasing of that seems off. I'm not quite sure that I understand exactly what you're saying here, but if you were to submit this application as is, would it go to panel is the sort of thing that we are looking at. And we decided to help in this way because we found that it's most helpful if we help people on the front end of their application process, not after they've already written it. So I have a few important disclaimers as we continue along with this presentation. This important disclaimer number one, with this slide including a big red exclamation point with a red circle around it, indicating how important this first important disclaimer is, which is that everything discussed today is in the guidelines, but we do not have time to recount everything that is in the guidelines during this webinar because it would take us hours. So please read the guidelines. It's really important. Do your best, read the guidelines. That said, we know those guidelines are long and complicated, and it is our job as program directors to be experts in those guidelines, and we really are happy to help. So ask us questions, but please do your best to read the guidelines ahead of time. Next important disclaimer, that red exclamation part with the point with a circle around it, is to forget what you knew about MRAC. So by this, we mean that many applicants who have been coming to MRAC for many years just need a refresher on what's new every year. And parts of the flexible support program might look familiar to those of you returning, but there are important changes to what we offer and the rules related to our funding opportunities. So to do your best in this program this year, please come to this program with fresh eyes. Don't assume anything based on what happened in the past. So we say that even if you're a veteran MRAC applicant, we are here to help you navigate. So even if you've been coming for a long time, there might be things that have changed, and it's important for you to come to it with fresh eyes. So here's the timeline for round one of flexible support. And there's a table here in that first column, the MRAC fiscal year, which is July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022. So that's our FY22 fiscal year, July to June. In round one of flexible support, the application deadline is Monday, August 9th at 11:59 p.m. That is a hard deadline, so make sure that you follow that. The award notification date, so when you will hear out whether you got it or not, is November 17th, 2021. And then the eligible funding period, so that the time in which you are eligible to be spending that money is November 17th, 2021, so the date that you were notified, through June 30th, 2023. We'll talk a little bit more about eligible funding period in a moment. I just want to get that in front of you right now. For round two, the fiscal year, the MRAC fiscal year flexible support round two, the application deadline is Monday, March 14th at 11:59 p.m. The award notification date is June 22nd, 2022. And then the eligible funding period is June 22nd, 2022, so the notification date, until June 30th, 2023, so the period in which you will complete your project. As the deadline hits, we'll begin reviewing all the applications for eligibility. So on this slide, labeled eligibility, staff will review for eligibility. That is our role as staff. We do not make decisions on funding. We review for eligibility and help folks apply. Please review those guidelines carefully. I already said it, I know, I will say it multiple times because it is really important. Staff may deem parts of your application or even the entire application ineligible because of one of those rules in the guidelines being broken. We hate to do it, but we do have to do it. Also, please make sure that you pay attention to your email through this entire process. We may contact you at any point after the deadline seeking necessary information to ensure your application is eligible. So it's important to keep an eye on it regularly. The applicant email will be the only way that we reach out to you during this time. We will give you a quick deadline if we need something. We might say we need it from you in the next 3 days, and it's important to respond in a timely manner. No response could mean that your application becomes ineligible, you lose out on an award, and that's heartbreaking for you and for us. In all cases, geographic eligibility is the name of the game for a regional arts council. So your group must have its primary address located in Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Hennepin, Ramsey, Scott, or Washington County. On the left is that map of MRAC's geographic region. So let's talk now about eligible groups. So the first is arts groups and organizations. These are federally tax exempt 501c3, so federally registered 501c3 nonprofit arts organizations with annual operating expenses of $400,000 or less. Next, second is cultural groups and organizations. So these are federally tax exempt 501c3 culturally specific nonprofit organizations that provide arts and non-arts programming with annual arts programming expenses of $400,000 or less. So arts and non-arts programming with arts programming of $400,000 or less. Next is fiscally sponsored groups with arts projects. So these are groups that have annual operating expenses of $400,000 or less at least 3 people in leadership, and have an eligible fiscal sponsor at the time of application. A fiscal sponsor is a tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofit organization that receives grant monies and manages the financial aspects of the project on behalf of the group that does not have their own tax-exempt status. Fiscal sponsors must be registered with the IRS as a federally tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofit with a Minnesota address and have an active registration with the Minnesota Secretary of State as a nonprofit organization. Groups that are fiscally sponsored must have operating expenses of $400,000 or less, at least 3 people in leadership, and have an eligible fiscal sponsor at the time of application. Reinforce at the time of application. MRAC requires a fiscal sponsor agreement letter to confirm that your organization or group has an active working relationship with the fiscal sponsor at the time of application. If you are a fiscally sponsored group, you'll be required to upload a letter or a relatively informal email from the fiscal sponsor. The guidelines have an outline of the specific things that must appear in that letter or email, but we also have fiscal sponsor letter templates on the resources page of our website and on the flexible support program page. I'm not sure that those are up now, but they will be up soon. So make sure you pay attention to all those things that are necessary for fiscal sponsor agreement letters. And I want to reinforce, it can be a relatively informal email. It doesn't need to be super intense. Don't let that be a barrier. Continuing eligible groups are non-arts and non-cultural nonprofit organizations. These are typically social service organizations, federally tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofit organizations with annual arts programming expenses of $400,000 or less. Non-arts and non-cultural nonprofit organizations must be able to isolate their arts programming expenses from their other non-arts and non-cultural financial activity. So it needs to be able to isolate. Also, public entities are eligible. Public entities such as a unit of state, local, or tribal government with arts expenses of $400,000 or less. Public entity must also be able to isolate their arts programming expenses from non-arts and non-cultural financial activity. And then finally, community education units of a school district with annual arts budgets of any size. Community education units must be able to isolate their arts programming expenses just like everyone else. So let's talk next about ineligible group. The following entities are ineligible. A group that has already been awarded a flexible support program grant in the same MRAC fiscal year. So this is not yet valid for anybody because nobody has yet been awarded a flexible support program grant for this MRAC fiscal year. The MRAC fiscal year runs July 2021, so this month, to, sorry, this should say June 2022. So 12 months from July 1st that we just had. So this will apply to literally no one in the first round, but may apply to somebody in the second round. Basically, if you already got the grant, don't apply again. You're not eligible to receive 2. Next, if you are located outside of Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Hennepin, Ramsey, Scott, or Washington counties, individuals are ineligible. So if you are an individual, please look at our individual arts programs for things that you might be eligible for. Public, private, alternative, charter, transitional, or home schools are also ineligible. This includes school support organizations such as PTAs, PTOs, school foundations. Schools are groups or organizations providing K through 12 education that meets state education requirements and post-secondary education leading to a degree or accreditation. That's what we mean by schools. And then finally, organizations whose main purpose is to raise funds for another person, organization, or cause. Basically, if you don't have your own programming. So now let's talk about a bunch of slides about ineligible project activities and expenses. After we talk about this bunch of stuff, we will be taking a break, so just be ready for that. But this is some not super fun stuff. And so these slides all have big red X's in them to reinforce all the super not fun rules that we have to enforce as we read your applications. So even though these slides aren't the most fun, I thought, because I'm fun, that I'd show you some different kinds of red X's on every slide. This is my desperate attempt to make these slides as tolerable as possible. So I hope you enjoy. So in this first slide, there's a pretty straightforward red X. It's made up of 2 equally thin and precise strokes with rounded ends. And I like to think it's like 2 breadsticks crossing each other over a bowl of spaghetti. So The following projects and expenses are ineligible on this first slide. Those that are not legally compliant. So those not upholding laws or attempting to influence legislation, those essentially for religious socialization of participants or audience, and those that discriminate against persons or groups. Those are all not legally compliant and are ineligible. Second, those outside of Minnesota. So activities that occur outside the state of Minnesota are ineligible. Travel expenses to or from Minnesota are ineligible, but you can engage an out-of-state artist or consultant. Just make sure that you don't include travel expenses to or from Minnesota in your budget at all. Don't even mention them. Costs for relocating an address out of Minnesota are also ineligible. Next is the ones that are outside the eligible funding period. This red X on this slide is a bit more casual, a little cash, slanted to one side, broad strokes like is made by a paintbrush. It's very casual. So next, outside the eligible funding period. So I said I talked a little bit more about the eligible funding period, and here it is. So the point is really important because we see the most issues and applications here in things occurring outside the eligible funding period. When an applicant gets these wrong, they often have their grant amount reduced or their entire application becomes ineligible. So please pay close attention to this section. So activities occurring outside the eligible funding period are ineligible. MRAC grants cannot be used for reimbursement. All expenses included in the grant proposal must be incurred within the eligible funding period listed for each grant round. And I've highlighted incurred in this slide because incurred expenses are those that are confirmed debts and or firm promises to pay whether or not cash has changed hands. I'll just say it again. Incurred expenses are those that are confirmed debts and or firm promises to pay whether or not cash has changed hands. So an example of this, performing artist fees. Those could be an incurred expense or they couldn't be. They would be an incurred expense at the time a contract is signed, even if the payment happens months later. So the moment you make a firm promise to pay, that's an incurred expense. That is ineligible. We do read about those things in applications. Make sure you're very thoughtful about not making any promises to pay to anyone before the eligible funding period begins. So on that note, this next slide has more about the eligible funding period. The proposal start date, so a field in the application is proposal start date. The proposal start date you enter in the application is the date on which you will begin incurring expenses for your project. So for round one, you must not, you can start incurring expenses on or after November 17th, 2021. For round two, you must begin incurring expenses on or after June 22nd, 2022. So that proposal start date cannot be before November 17th or June 22nd, depending on what your round deadline is. The latest possible proposal end date is June 30th, 2023. So everything needs to happen within those periods. Oh, and this slide, by the way, let me go back for a second. I want to make sure that we talk about these X's because they're really important. So the red X on this slide brings us back, from that past casual one to a more formal composition. It's thick with squared off ends and a severe, almost militaristic quality. Turned on its side, it would be the logo for the Red Cross, but in this position, it just tells us a firm no. I hope you're enjoying these verbal descriptions because I had fun writing them. All right, the red X on this slide is sort of builds on that last one, that same severe blocky X, which is now contained in a thinner red circle. It tells us not only no, but specifically not this. So here are some less common situations for ineligible project activities that are also really important. So those that are managed by another entity other than the applicant are ineligible. Also ineligible, those designed to raise funds, re-grant, or donate funds to another entity. Your project cannot be raising funds for another entity. Those substituting other state dollars, So arts education projects, please review this very, very closely in the guidelines. Please reach out to us if you have questions about whether your arts education project might be violating this particular eligibility point. It is a little confusing and we are truly happy to help. Next, capital projects. So facilities and improvements and facility improvements and equipment purchases that are to leased spaces that you do not own that are not approved by the property owner. So we can't give you money to do an improvement that the property owner isn't on board with. And then finally, no capital improvements can be made to residential properties. So here's some specific ineligible budget items, but first we have another X. This one really changes it up. Instead of an X, a red X on a white background, this is a white X on a red circular background. It's a playful inversion. White X, typewriter font, a little messy. I'd say approachable. It's an approachable font. So specific ineligible budget items, those that are unrealized income, which means things like scholarships or in-kind income, are ineligible. Purchasing of real estate property, purchase of alcoholic beverages or to pay associated costs, development of endowments and debt reduction and building cash reserves, all those are ineligible budget items. Also, arts groups and organizations and fiscally sponsored groups with arts projects, you're allowed to have capital funds up to the full request amount. You may request $15,000 for capital improvements if you wish. However, cultural groups and organizations, non-arts and non-cultural nonprofit organizations, public entities, and community education units, you can only use up to 50% of the amount requested from MRAC for capital expenses. So if your request is $15,000, you may request up to $7,500 of that for capital expenses. This is the, I think I just skipped over one by accident. There we go. I have just 2 more slides before we take another break for questions, and then we'll take a little bio break. But first, the red X on this slide, made up of 2 thin pencil-like strokes. My notes for this say that this X is at once forceful and demure, right? So other than timeline issues, the rule I'll describe next is the one that's the most frequent point where we see issues. So again, please pay close attention to this. So expenses that are included in another MRAC grant are ineligible. So that includes those that are already covered by another MRAC grant that you've been awarded, or those that are already requested in another pending MRAC application. If you include a given expense in your project budget, you may not ever include this same expense in any other grant proposal you submit to MRAC. So just make sure if you ask for a given expense once from us, you may never ask for it again. We will take it out of your budget if we catch it. And then the last slide before we pause quickly for questions and take a little bio break. This slide is specific to those of you who have active MRAC grants. So if you have a previous grant from MRAC, and those of you who have pending applications, again, right now we're at the beginning of the fiscal year, so nobody has a pending application, but this will become important if you decide to apply for round 2. So on this, just want to label, let's say specifically, if you have a previous, meaning fiscal year 21 grant from MRAC, you are eligible. This could include an organizational development grant, arts project grant, lots of our old grant programs, you are eligible to apply for flexible support. If you have an FY21, so our previous fiscal year equity response grant, you are eligible. If you have a previous flexible support grant, you may be eligible. There are 2 sections that I want to point out. Please refer to the already have another MRAC grant award or submitted an application in another program section of the guidelines, the flexible support guidelines. If you're, see, I'm losing spot. If your FY21 flexible support grant project will not be complete by the dates that are listed in the eligible funding period, you are not eligible to apply for a flexible support grant. However, you may request a project change to your FY21 grant project to revise its timeline if the project will actually be complete before the deadline originally given in your previous application. You must request and receive approval for a project change before submitting your new application. So please refer to the project changes page on the website under the grants tab to learn about how to make a project change if this applies to you. If you have a pending application in the FY22 Arts Impact for Groups grant program, whether you received that grant or you have a pending application, you are also eligible in this program. Again, in all cases, if there are project expenses from either of these grant programs, if there are project expenses from these other grants and applications appearing in your new flexible support application, they are ineligible. Do not repeat expenses from your previous or pending applications in your new one. So I'd be remiss to not describe this last X, which I think is the most beautiful. It's this woodblock-like serif font made up of horizontal lines with heavier lines on the left side, lighter lines on the right side. It reminds me of the IBM logo, but it's got this like hint of old-timey circus poster energy thanks to this drop shadow. I hope you've really enjoyed taking this Red X tour with me. It's been fun for me. All right, with that, we've got our next stop in the questions train. So any questions here? We have this white question mark and a black circle. So if you have any questions about application process, application accessibility, before applying resources, timelines, organizational eligibility, ineligible projects, and expenses. I know this is a big section. So again, please try to keep your questions limited to those that are relevant to others in the group and not those that are necessarily highly specific to your situation. I can tell the chat's been blowing up, so I'm really excited to hear how much people are enjoying my Red X tour and if there are any questions available.
Hi, Scott. There are a number of questions, as you have probably surmised. Folks who have asked the questions, please know that I'm not necessarily going to say them aloud in chronological order that I receive them, and I will try to say them all. So I will start with the question, please define access to the arts.
We are going to be talking, this is an excellent question, and we are going to be talking about defining your project in the next section after we take a little bio break. So I'd say hold on to your question for now, and if it's not clear after that, let's get to it again.
Wonderful. 3 people have asked, can you be an applicant and also a fiscal sponsor? So they've been asked slightly differently, 3 different ways.
Oh yeah, you can, in fact. Your projects that you're a fiscally sponsor, you're not executing those projects, you're just serving as the fiscal sponsor. You are allowed to do your own as long as you are eligible.
Someone would like to know the definition of cultural organization.
Yeah, a cultural organization, and these are a little bit slippery, I know, but what our definition is an organization that is culturally specific. So one that has specific ties to a specific culture and that provides both non-art services and art services. So for example, an organization serving a particular cultural community, say Latinx organization, so one serving the Latinx population of Minnesota, they might have social services like tax preparation, daycare, and they might also have arts programming that is in addition to their social services. So cultural organizations are those.
All right, someone asked in the chat that if they are an arts organization, is it okay to request the full amount of the grant for capital expenses?
Yes, that is true. If you are an arts organization, 501c3 arts organization, or fiscally sponsored arts organization, you are able to request the full amount for capital expenses. We know that your work, everything that you do supports access to the arts, is creativity. And so purchasing of equipment to help you do your work better would be access to the arts, so yes.
Another person would like to know, can we apply for both flexible support and arts impact for groups?
You may apply for both of those. Yep. They do need to be, again, completely different expenses. So I would say if you're planning on applying for both, please reach out to a program director so that we can make sure that you are approaching both of these in the way that benefits you the most. But you are able to apply for both if you are eligible in both.
Scott, I'd like to add a little bit to that response, which is that arts impact for groups will have slightly different organizational eligibility. So it will also depend on that as well. There are a number of budget questions which are excellent. Let me get back to them so I say them correctly. One is regarding ineligible expenses. Are you saying that if we apply for round one and are not awarded the grant, if you apply in round two, you may not include expenses from the round one grant?
That's a fair question, because I will say it's a question I would probably have. If you have been denied a grant and included those expenses in your application that was denied, then you could do it again. This really only applies, don't include expenses in an application that you have already received the grant for, or one for which you are still awaiting a response. So if you have a pending application or an already awarded application, that's where you wouldn't want to repeat things. But if you weren't awarded a grant and you want to try again, absolutely, you can include those same requests again.
Another budget-related question is, are expenses to commission an original composition allowed in this grant program?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not an unusual expense. I'd say that it's one that we see pretty often. So yeah, paying artists to do work is absolutely what this funding is for.
Someone has a question about what is the documentation MRAC needs from our landlord if we are seeking capital funds to a lease space to show that it is approved?
We do not require it in the application at this point, but we may make it a requirement for you to actually receive the funding to submit some documentation, some official documentation from the landlord, from the property owner saying, yes, that this group has permission to execute this project on my property.
Someone would like a definition of an arts organization. They are a startup museum where one part of their programming is focused on the arts.
That's a complicated question. What is art after all, right? I'd encourage you to reach out to a program director and chat through that a little bit more.
There are other questions, but I believe you will be covering those topics in later slides.
Great. And if we don't, for whatever reason, happy to chat through them later. So I'm going to just give us a couple minutes to take a little bio break, take a stretch. If you prefer to use this time, feel free to spend a moment jotting down kind of project ideas or adding any additional questions to the chat, and we'll come back to that later. So let's get back together. I have 10:48 right now, so let's come back in 2 minutes, 10:50, and we will chat more. All right, I got 10:50, so let's get started again. Pull up my notes again. All right, hope that break was good. So let's talk about the purpose of the flexible support program. This whole section is going to be about the purpose of the program and how to define your projects. Hopefully it gets at some of those questions that just came up. So the flexible support grant program provides up to $15,000 in funding to help groups create access to the arts and stay connected to audiences and community in Minnesota. So I made a little visual, which helps. I'm a visual learner, so this helps me understand it a little bit more. On this slide, there are 3 colored circles which lie next to each other with text in each. All of these circles are encased in an orange rectangle labeled increasing a community's access to the arts. The blue circle says organizational capacity. The red circle says arts programming, and the yellow circle says operations. The flexible support program is designed to be a flexible container for just about any project your group wants to undertake. We present these 3 major buckets to spark your thinking. Your group gets to define which activities it will do, and we call this your project. So for us, project means a collection of activities that are described in this application. Any of the types of activities appearing in these circles independently or in some combination could be the organization's project or program. As panelists are reviewing, we ask them to be very careful to consider the projects as described on their own merits. We don't want them to favor arts programming projects because they're fun and they're more obviously supporting access to the arts by providing those arts. We understand that each of these components is critical to a healthy arts ecosystem, and we're asking you to identify those activities that will help you do your work. What's also important is figuring out the project that is the right fit to make an impact on your community's access to the arts. And you should be demonstrating that you have an effective plan to get there. Serving more people doesn't automatically make it a better project. So focus on doing what you do best. Keep in mind the maximum request is $15,000, and projects that are appropriately scaled to that $15,000 grant will fare better in the program. If you have a big project, please consider what parts of that project you choose to focus on as the quote unquote project of your application. I'm going to talk about defining your project a little bit more next. So we use the word project a lot. So I'm going to repeat our definition just to make it extra clear. For MRAC, the project means the collection of activities that are described in the application. So your project then could be a first-time event or activity the group has never produced before during the eligible funding period. It could be a recurring annual or seasonal event it has produced before that occurs during the eligible funding period. It could be portions of an ongoing program that clearly fall within the eligible funding period. And it also could be an activity supporting the organizational capacity or operations of the group. So that could look like equipment purchases, management projects, or personnel expenses that clearly fall within the eligible funding period. So your project could be a combination of all these things too, like funding a dance class, paying your bookkeeper, and buying a new sound system. All of that would be one project, even though it sounds like 3 separate components. So that was a really quick section, but it is a really important one. So I do want to take a pause to ask if there are any questions about the purpose of the program or defining your project. And if that previous question about defining your project was answered.
Scott, there have been a couple more questions about budget in the chat. May I say them aloud now?
Of course.
One of them was, would an instrument purchase be considered a capital expense?
I'm not a tax expert, but I think typically something that has a life beyond a year is typically considered a capital expense. So we say facilities improvements, equipment purchases. I think that might fall under equipment purchases.
I agree with you there, Scott. And I did answer this next question in the chat, but did want to say it aloud for everybody. And this question is, if you have a large project whose budget is over $15,000, can you request MRAC funds to add to those granted from the city of St. Paul for an artist designed and created art project? To which I replied, yes. And our guidelines now include budget scenarios and examples, and one of them covers this exact instance.
Yep, and you all have Masami to thank for that, for making these amazing budgets to help make that clear. I will be talking about budgets more specifically soon, so
and
get ready.
Another question relating to what you just covered is, are projects that include all three components, organizational capacity, arts programming, and operations, be more favorable under the grant review process by the panel?
So this is a great question, and it's one that we had as well. Like I said, we've made it very clear to panelists that they need to be thinking about all of these things as critical. And we tracked the kinds of projects that were proposed and how well they fared. And really what we found is there is no preference for any component or any combination of components. There are certainly ones that are more commonly requested, but they didn't fare any better or worse than any other. So I will reinforce, ask for the thing that, define your project for the thing that will be best for your organization. What do you actually need? Because projects that don't fare as well are those that maybe don't feel like they align quite clearly with what the organization needs. Any additional questions?
I don't see any additional questions in the chat, but if anyone who asked these questions feel they were not clearly explained, please do feel free to unmute now or retype in the chat, please.
I'm going to actually move us along just in the interest of time, but if your questions were not answered, then feel free to drop that in the chat or reach out to us individually later. So application components. So this is all about the content of the application. This is probably our longest section. I will be going through this pretty quickly with apologies to our interpreter and captioners. So just in the interest of time, I do need to go pretty quickly. But again, if you are using either of those services and don't feel like you got everything, just know that our interpreter and captioner are doing an amazing job for the challenge that I'm throwing at them, and I'm happy to chat with you afterward. So let's look at the application components. These are the ones that are seen by panel. On this slide is a green icon of a human eye. So all of the information in these sections will be made available to panelists. So this is where we want you to really focus your energy because they will be part of the review. Those components are group's purpose, the project or program name and description, the project or program, so information about that, community section, proposal budgets, and the fiscal sponsor name if applicable, so that panelists can see if they have a conflict of interest for a given application. The application components that are not seen by the panel, which is delineated with that green eye again with a big black line through it. These are things that are not seen by the panel, so they won't be part of your review. It is important to pay attention to these fields and answer them honestly, but the panelists won't know any details about what's in these fields unless you also include it in the narrative somewhere, so somewhere that is seen by the panel. So just know they won't know that you're serving 5,000 students unless you put it in the narrative. So the things that are not seen by the panel, start and end dates, the outcomes proposed, evaluation plan, fiscal sponsor letter or email, and then lots and lots of data for reporting. And that data includes data about your organization or group and about the specific project you are proposing. Most of that data is because the state requires of us to report back to them, and some of it helps us better serve our region. So thanks for all that data can be a lot. Thanks for your attention to it. Here are some application tips. You will type your application into the text boxes online. Character counts do include letters, numbers, spaces, and paragraph breaks. There's no formatting, meaning bold or italic, so make sure you're paying attention to word counts. Do not include links in narrative text fields. The application system will auto-save your work every few minutes, but some applicants may wish to work in another document and paste your answers in once written. We do provide templates available for download on the Flexible Support Grant Program page for you to do that. So this is about the proposal narrative. So the narrative is your primary tool for panelists to learn about your group and its work. I've included the components of the narrative here, which include group purpose, project, group purpose is 1,500 characters maximum. The project or program name, 100 characters maximum. Project and program description, 200 characters maximum. Project or program description, 3,000 or 3,000 characters maximum. And then community, 3,000 characters maximum. Proposal budgets, 1,000 characters maximum each. So just noting that those sections, project or program and community, are 3,000 characters each. Group purpose is 1,500. That's really where you're going to get the most information to panelists. It's important that you write as if the reader doesn't know anything about your group, your community, or your arts discipline. In general, the more specific and tangible a proposal reads, the better it does with panel ratings. So help panelists picture exactly what you will do. I'll note that the character limit is the maximum characters. You do not need to fill the entire text box if you don't need it. But I encourage you to make sure you have fully answered each question posed. For some groups, especially younger groups, or those with really simple projects, you may not need to use all that space, and that's totally okay, as long as panelists can get information that they need to make decisions. So first up is the group purpose, 1,500 characters max. Consider numbering your responses to the numbered questions. First question, what are the group's goals or intentions? And then in general, what kind of arts programming does your group plan to produce or has it produced? This section helps introduce your group to panels who may not be familiar with what you do or your group's artistic output. Next is the project or program name and description. The name, 100 characters maximum. In a few words, what is the name or title of your project or program? And then the description of 200 characters, so again, very brief, 1 to 2 sentence summary of your project, beginning with the phrase funding to or funding for. Next, project or program, so a big section, 3,000 characters maximum. Again, consider numbering your responses. 1, describe the project for which the group seeks funding. 2, what are the goals of this project or program? 3, in what ways does this project or program align with or advance the group's goals? And 4, what are the activities that will take place? Where will the activities take place? Describe the major activities or tasks that take place between the start and end date of your program or project. Next up is community, 3,000 characters. Again, consider numbering your responses. 1, describe the people your project or program benefits and how these people are aligned with the group. 2, describe the connection between this project or program and how it will benefit the people previously described in question 1. And then 3, who are the people working on the project or program? Describe their roles within the project or program. How are they aligned to the project or program's goals? Next up is budgets for the project. So this is a picture of the financial aspects of the project, especially how you plan to spend the money. Budgets are where we see the most issues. And so what I'm going to present now is an overview, but in the guidelines, there's a lot of guidance that will help you avoid issues. And I will shout out those example budgets that Masami prepared. Some overall things to say about budgets: make sure you don't include ineligible items, including in-kind items, scholarships, ineligible expenses. Even if, just don't include them. Don't ever include them. Keep in mind budgets have to match, meaning your total expenses and total income must be the same number. Staff will be tabulating all of these sections, so double check all of your math, and then maybe double check it again. And then those sample budgets and checklists are available in the guidelines. There's a version if MRAC is the only funding source for the project or program, and then there's a version for if it's one of multiple funding sources for the project or program. This kind of harkens back to that question about a project that is also funded by another funder. So the project budget expenses, 1,000 characters. This is where you're going to be listing the major expenses of your proposal with dollar amounts and short descriptions. Do not include in-kind expenses or in other ineligible expenses. I'm saying this a lot because it is really important. Your project may be larger than the amount requested in this grant program, and the sum of all items listed in this section will be the total project cash expenses. There are examples of eligible expenses. I'm not going to go over these right now, but they are available in the guidelines. I will, however, encourage you to carefully review project eligibility and ineligible projects and ineligible expenses sections of the guidelines, including those ineligible expenses may affect your MRAC award or your eligibility in the program. So make sure you take a look at those. Project income. List the major cash income sources with dollar amounts and short descriptions. So again, in those sample budgets, there's the version if your only funding source is MRAC, and then a version if you have multiple funding sources for the project. And then here's some examples of income budget pieces. I'm not going to go over these right now, but I want to reinforce that the income budget must exactly match the expense budget. If it's not matching, there's something wrong. So that's what's in the application. I want to now talk about review criteria. So criteria are the lens through which panelists are asked to focus their review of your application. You can download the panel rating guide on the Flexible Support Program page that includes information all about the review criteria. This may be a useful tool to you as you craft the application. MRAC believes that stronger applications demonstrate a group has clear goals, an effective project design, and the necessary relationships to make the work meaningful to the community. Therefore, the review criteria are group and project goals, project design, and relationships. A highly rated application will clearly demonstrate how each criterion informs and aligns with the other two criteria. In the slide is a circle split up into 3 equal sections with arrows pointing in both directions between each section. The sections are listed with those criteria names, group project and goals, project design, and relationships. The panel will apply all 3 criteria to the application as a whole. For example, there may be information in your budget that supports the strength of the project design criteria. On this slide is the 1 through 5 rating scale with a horizontal orange arrow indicating a spectrum. Panelists will be reviewing all applications online through the grant portal and individually score each proposal assigned to them. They will rate each criterion from 1 to 5, where 5 is the top score. Criteria ratings are then combined for a total application score of 3 to 15. Scores are then averaged across panelists for a final rating. Panelists are asked to use the full scale as they rate applications. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, use all of them. We ask panelists to think about their scoring like this. At the bottom of the scale, at the top of the scale, a 5. The criterion is addressed with robust specificity and intention. There is clear alignment with other criteria. At the bottom of the scale, a 1, the criterion is not really addressed or is significantly misaligned with the other criteria. And in the middle, a 3, the criterion is addressed, but maybe vaguely or generically, and there is an unclear or questionable alignment with the other criteria. So a 2 then would be somewhere between the bottom and the middle, and then a 4 is somewhere between the middle and the top. Panelists will be required to write at least 1 comment about their feedback and reasoning for their ratings. We specifically direct panels to look for the content of the application, not how eloquently the words are written. This is an important equity issue, as applicants should not be scored lower because English is a learned language or because they have a reading disorder like dyslexia. You may find it helpful to get a friend or colleague who is less familiar with your organization or project, review your application with the rating guide provided as a way to think through your application. So I'm next going to go through the rating guide. Again, this is available on the for download on the Flexible Support Grant Program page. So each of these criteria, the panelist is asked to answer this question: to what extent do you agree with the following points? So under group and project goals, 1 to 5, how much do you agree with the following? The applicant has described specific goals or intentions overall that create or contribute to the group's capacity to create access to the arts. The applicant's vision for how it produces arts activities is relevant to the interests and needs of the community it is designed to benefit. The applicant has made a compelling case for why the proposed project aligns with or advances the group's goals and intentions. Next is project design. To what extent do you agree with the following? The project details are thoroughly considered. The scope is appropriate. Activities will effectively produce the intended outcomes for the group. And finally, the project's design will create or contribute to the group's capacity to create meaningful access to the arts that is inclusive and accessible to community members marginalized because of race, disability, and other kinds of oppression. Next, relationships. It's our last criterion. To what extent do you agree with the following? The applicant has clearly defined a community or communities that will benefit from the project or program, meaning who is in this community, who is served in or by this community. The project described is specifically designed to benefit this community, and has well-defined methods of reaching the intended community members and meeting their needs. Finally, the applicant has demonstrated that people working on the project authentically reflect and are positioned to serve this community. I also want to talk a bit about the leadership sections of the application. These are not shared with panelists and therefore are not part of their review. The first field, called leadership, asks you to list the individuals who will lead your group by first and last name separated by commas with their expertise, profession, or organizational affiliation. Do not list bios in this section. So for example, Masami Kawasato, community organizer, treasurer, boom. Yes, it really is that simple. To MRAC, group leaders are defined as the people who are in positions of power. So include core decision makers of the group's overall operations. This must include all board members and the executive director or equivalent positions. If applicable, include an advisory committee. Fiscally sponsored groups should not include the staff or board members of the group's fiscal sponsor, but should include core decision makers of its own group's activities, including an advisory committee if applicable. And the next slide about leadership, individuals named on this list must know they are part of the team when that proposal is submitted. We do need a minimum of 3 individuals listed as part of that team. If you list less than 3 people, your application will be ineligible. Then there are a series of leadership identities questions that ask you to tell us about the identities of those same people you just listed in the leadership field. This information is gathered to determine eligibility for the portion of grant funds MRAC has set aside for groups whose leadership is more than 50% Black, Indigenous, people of color, and or people with disabilities, and or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, agender, two-spirit. I'm so impressed with our interpreter for getting that. You may choose not to disclose this information by not answering. You would answer 0 in each of those fields. This information is shared in aggregate, meaning all of the numbers from applicants are added together without associated identities and shared with the MRAC Board of Directors. This is so we can track the distribution of funds. Please reach out to us if you're struggling with this section. We know it can be challenging and want to help you get it right. I will also note that a portion of grant funds have also been set aside for groups whose primary address is located in Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Scott, Washington, and suburban Hennepin counties. So all suburban Hennepin and Ramsey counties. So all of those places outside for the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, where we see the vast majority of applications. The information submitted in the leadership identities section will not be provided to panelists as part of the review of your application. All right, that was a lot of information. We have just a little bit over 10 minutes left of this presentation. Overall, I do want to open up for questions about application content. Any of those application components, what's seen, what's not seen, narrative, project budgets, review criteria, including the review scale and rating guide, and anything about those leadership components.
Scott, there was a question about budgets, which is someone wanted to confirm that there is not a cash match for this grant program.
Correct. You do not need to bring any of your own money to this program. We just want to give you money to do what you want to do.
There are also a number of questions about panel and panelists. So in response, I share the panelists webpage that we have. So one of the questions was, who are panelists? Another one is, how are panelists chosen?
Panelists are peer evaluators, so they're folks who are in the community with you. We structure application reviews to include panelists who live in those communities where the applications are coming from. So the folks who live in Minneapolis will be, or St. Paul, will be looking at applications from Minneapolis or St. Paul. Folks who live in Carver, Dakota, Washington will be reviewing applications from that same part of the region. And they are selected based on their place within the arts community, their expertise and understanding of the arts world. It's really folks who are experts in their lived experience in the region and participation in arts and cultural activities.
Someone asked 4 questions about panel, but I believe you have answered them all. If that is not the case, please tell us so in the chat or unmute. And someone just asked, how is the benefit for the organization and also community weighed out? I'm not quite sure what that means.
So all of the criteria are weighted equally. So each criterion, 1 through 5, all of them are weighted the same. So there's no heavier weight to any particular criterion. One thing to note is that the criteria are different than the application questions. That's an intentional choice that I won't get into the full thought behind right now. I'm happy to chat with you more about it later if you wish. But the main point is the questions are set up for you to tell the story of your application and provide as much information as possible for those panelists to review. And then the panelists will be reviewing based on that rating scale. So as you're creating your application, and crafting your narrative, I would suggest you look back and forth between the rating guide and the questions that are in the application, and then get somebody else who's maybe less familiar with your work to review your application according to that rating guide.
Someone asked for clarification, I believe on the slide about leadership.
Let's go back there.
Am I understanding this question correctly? If not, please let me know. But they would like to know. You said a few words that were not on the slide, so such as LGBTQIA2+.
Yeah, what's the question there?
Let me find it again. I don't see where you are reading from, Scott, and it was relating to identity information that was not on the screen, such as LGBTQIA2+. Yeah, I'm gonna ask this person to unmute if that is okay, Scott.
Sounds good.
Yes, please.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering if maybe the slides were frozen or something, but I physically heard you saying LGBTQ, this kind of identity thing, but I wasn't seeing any of that language on the slides. So I got lost as to where we were.
Got it. Yeah, so sorry about that. That's obviously, as a member of the LGBTQIA2+ community, I know that our acronym is long. And I did not include all of the language on here just because it made the slide less legible, basically. But just to repeat what I said in that section, so these leadership identities question ask about the identities of the people who are listed in that leadership section. So we ask whether they're BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and or people with disabilities, and or LGBTQIA2+. So part of the queer and trans community.
I see. It was in regard to the leadership, and those are specific questions that I asked. Thank you.
Great. Any further questions?
Yes, there is one that is there a place to list bios of the main artists who carry out the project?
So we do not have a specific like bios or personnel section. I'm just flipping through the slides here. So under the community section, there is community section question number 3 says, who are the people working on the project or program? Describe their roles within the project or program. How are they aligned with the project or program goals? So that's really, I at this point, I think listing bios, probably not your best bet. Describing the backgrounds and fit of the people that you have chosen to work on this project and why they're a good fit is going to be a better use of that real estate than copying and pasting bios into that section. In general, we have significantly slimmed down this application from what we've had previously. Not having uploads, not having 5-page essays. We're really doing our best to make it as easy as possible for everyone to apply. So not seeing the personnel section that you're maybe used to, that's understandable. And so I think what we're now asking you to do is just make those connections between the personnel that are involved and why they're involved as explicit as possible. So help the panelists understand why these folks are involved. If there's any piece of information you really wish were in there somewhere, I'll bet there's a place you can find to put it in.
Scott, there's an additional question about community, but given the time and the additional slides, may I suggest that we answer some of these additional questions at the very end?
That's a great idea. I'm just going to flip through these really quickly. So next up is a section about submitting your application, receiving the award. What happens once you submit your application? So all applications must be submitted by the 11:59 deadline. That is a hard deadline. And it's because we have to draw a hard deadline somewhere, not because we like to, we just have to. So we might as well make it the actual deadline. If you do not have access to a computer or internet, please contact us well before the deadline. We're happy to work with you to find a way for you to apply. Staff technical assistance is available until 5 p.m. on the deadline day. If you can't log into your account after 5 p.m. on deadline day, it's going to be really sad. So please make sure that all the technical stuff is ready for you to apply before 5 p.m. on the deadline day. And then please have an active email address that you check often. Official communications happen through that email. And we, again, may contact you at any point between the submission and final decisions. The MRAC grant interface is available on the MRAC website. On the right of this slide is a screenshot of the homepage at MRAC.org. There are 3 yellow buttons, one with a green arrow pointing to the button labeled Manage My Organizational Grant. We ask you to please use one account per organization. However, there can be multiple people or contacts in the organization. If you want any help with that, please reach out to us early. We'll help you figure it out. Your login ID is your email address, not the organization's name, so just know that. Obviously, it's a question we get pretty often. And then you can reset your password if needed. And if you would like additional assistance with that, MRAC staff can help you. So let's talk about if you receive an award. On this slide, there is a picture of fireworks in multiple colors exploding in the sky. Very exciting, very celebratory. We ask you, if you receive an award, to sign the grant agreement and upload a W-9, which is a tax form dated within this fiscal year. So the MRAC fiscal year, July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022. Don't predate it, obviously, but sign it within this MRAC fiscal year. So make that grant agreement is available on the online portal. And then a check will be issued to your group or the group's fiscal sponsor. If you're using a fiscal sponsor, that will be shipped to that address. So if you are fiscally sponsored, you will not get a check in the mail to you specifically. Your fiscal sponsor will get it. Please also make sure that you are paying attention to the required acknowledgement of the grant program. We have both use of the MRAC logo and the legacy amendment logo, if that is required, and then some language attached to that. The reason we require that acknowledgement, it's not because we want to be famous, but because we think it's really important that the public knows that these are state arts dollars that are funding this project. And if they want to make sure that this money continues to be around, that they need to contact their legislators and fight for it to keep being available for arts funding. Finally, or not finally, second to finally, communicate project changes ahead of time. If there are any changes that happen in your project, please contact us ahead of time. If you make significant changes before you submit your final report, we might say, "Ooh, you did everything that you weren't supposed to, so now you need to return the funds to us." We don't want to have to do that, so please contact us ahead of time with project changes. And then finally, submit your final report, which will be due 2 months after the project end date that is listed in your application. My last slide here, additional questions, which we will take space for. I also just want to point out a couple of links here. One is to the flexible support page on the MRAC website, mrac.org/flexible support with a hyphen in between. There is that help with your application section at the bottom with the meeting request form. Really, that's going to be your best way to get a hold of anybody. And then mrac.org/grants, we have a new feature, which is the Welcome to MRAC Grants section of our website that's available there. A great introduction if you are a first-time applicant, if you are wondering if you haven't been to MRAC in a while and want to know what's going up, this is a great place for you to start and get some context and some real tactical help on preparing your application. And you can also find information about our other grant programs that will be coming down the line the rest of this fiscal year. With that, I want to open up for any additional questions. We're at 11:29, so I just want to respect everyone's time. If you do need to log off, remember that the recording will be available on YouTube on Monday, and then we will be opening up the help with your application meeting request form also on Monday.
Scott, there's a new question in the chat, which is, do you have any suggestions about describing an audience in the community section? This person has found that challenging in the past.
Yeah, in broad strokes, in terms of advice for everybody, I would say think about your audience as part of your community, not separate from your community. So there's lots of ways to think about who your audience is. If you're not sure who your audience is, I would say maybe think differently about how you describe your community. I think it is important to have a full picture of who is involved. And I think there's lots of ways to approach it. No one size fits all answers, I'm sorry, but happy to work with you if you want to reach out to us.
I also added in the chat that generally our advice is to be specific. So for example, panelists often like to know approximately how many people might make up a community, right? Because there is a difference between 10 people and 100 people and 1,000 people. So, and you want to make sure that those questions, or your answers align to the questions asked.
Great advice. Thank you, Ms. Emi.
I do want to acknowledge there are a handful of questions that were in the chat that I did not ask out loud because they were not necessarily related to this MRAC application process.
Okay. Well, I want to respect everyone's time. It is 11:31 now, so we are officially past our time. But thank you everyone for being here, making time to be here. I know that there are lots of options for you to be spending your time this morning, and I appreciate that you took the time to be here. So I wasn't just talking to my computer, or that I was talking to my computer, but also you. So thank you so much for being here. Happy to help. Please reach out to us. I am going to stop recording, but I will stick around for a little bit just to answer any additional questions that might come up.